So as they're drilling this borehole, keep in mind that this is just raw rock, right? The walls of the resulting hole are just bedrock, and that's not very stable. So we actually add a metal casing to the outside of the borehole, and that metal casing is similar to like an old school antenna, like the kind that you can have this like a telescoping antenna. And so as the hole is being drilled, they're also inserting well casing, which actually has a little bit of a gap, so you can see kind of in cross section how that would look. So it's these long segments that are joined together in a way similar to like a telescoping antenna. And then also now there's space between the well casing, which is a steel casing, and the edge of the well itself. And we fill that with something called bentonite clay. Bentonite clay is a really interesting earth material, right? It's a natural resource. But it's a type of clay that expands when it comes in contact with moisture. So we kind of pack in the sides of the well, and if that clay is doing its job, it hopefully provides a buffer, right? So if there's groundwater that's flowing through these rocks and gets into this well, that clay will expand and keep the well protected. As we're going to see, particularly when we start talking about natural gas, this doesn't always work. And actually, we don't often know if it worked or not. We just kind of throw the bentonite down there and hope that it worked, right? Or you have some idea of the amount of volume that you need. So the last step is this well casing. As we get down to the bottom of where we're interested, that well casing is perforated. So a portion of this well casing is what we call screened or perforated or filled with holes. And the people who are installing the well make sure that the well casing is only screened or perforated within the rocks, the stretch of rocks that they're interested in extracting oil from, right? So not the entire thing is perforated, just the portion that you're interested in. And actually it works the same way as a groundwater well, right? We do the same thing there. In that case, we only have it screened in layers of rock that host groundwater, right? So same concept, but here with oil. So here I've drawn a pretty rudimentary sketch of our borehole and our rock layers. I've left out all of the details within the borehole, right? All of the ways that we pull that oil back out. So one of the things that we learned pretty quickly is that when we get down into a rock layer that we're interested in, so I've drawn again, this is our oil-bearing layer that we're after. The production will be fairly high in the beginning, right? Because all of the oil is there. And as you start to extract that oil, the stuff closest to the well comes out first, obviously. And then remember that there's this notion of permeability and porosity. So over here, let's review what that means. So let's imagine that this is a sandstone and we're really zoomed in, 1 centimeter. Remember that that oil lives in the pore spaces between the sand grains as it's kind of come up from down below. But if that sand is fairly fine-grained, or it's really packed really tightly, you start to lose what we call conductivity. So for a material to be an effective host, it has to be both porous and permeable, meaning fluids can travel through it. So if this material is really fine-grained, fluid will still flow through it, but really slow. So again, the oil that's close to the well, we can get pretty easily. And really early in the oil days, we figured out that as that oil production rate starts to decline, it's because the oil can't get through the rocks very quickly. So there was a great idea proposed way back in the day, and somebody said, well, let's just blow the whole damn thing up. So that's what they did. This was a process called torpedoing. You can actually see here, this is a torpedo, an oil torpedoing or a petroleum torpedoing company. You can actually even see the patent here. This is a device that you would drop down your well, In the early days, they would actually just be packed with nitroglycerin, which is a type of explosive that will explode on impact. And so when it hits the bottom of the well, kablooey, right? And generally what it would form is this, what they would call wagon wheel pattern of fractures. So in this kind of radial way, all of these rocks would be smashed up and broken and fractured. Maybe that term is starting to sound familiar. And as that explosion fractured these underlying rocks, now oil can flow more easily, and so the oil production goes back up. So it turns out, the torpedoing didn't always work. It worked in most cases. I went to a talk at a conference a couple of years ago. There was a session where we were talking about the history of fracking, right? Because fracking is always in the news. We'll talk about modern fracking in our natural gas module, which will be a few weeks from now. But really, it started in the oil industry, right? And actually, so these torpedoing companies didn't necessarily guarantee that you would have increased production. And there's really one kind of famous story. I was totally blown away by this. So there was one individual. The oil world was much different back then. So there's one individual, and he owned one oil well, and he had kind of sunk all of his money into it, and the production dropped off. And so he hired a torpedoing company to come out and torpedo his well, and they did. And basically the well shut off, meaning the conductivity wasn't there. Maybe there wasn't as much oil in the reservoir as they had thought. And so his oil well was kaput. And he gathered up the money that he had and decided to go to Washington, D.C. and become an actor. Right, this is really long time ago. And yeah, he was a fairly politically active figure. And famously, so he was in Washington, D.C. working as an actor. And he shot the president. Right, so Abraham Lincoln, you could say that Abraham Lincoln was a casualty of the oil industry, right? So John Wilkes Booth was running a well in Pennsylvania. It was torpedoed, it shut down. He moved to Washington, D.C., became an actor, ultimately killed the president. Whoa, right? I was blown away when I learned that, so kind of interesting story. So while we're on the subject of recovery, this notion of fracking, like I was drawing here, again, in the early days, torpedoing, right, with these nitroglycerin things, which was really dangerous. People died because nitroglycerin, if it falls off the truck, it will explode. And so it was an incredibly dangerous job. So that technology starts to advance, but really it's still driven by the notion of explosions. And so you can see here are a couple of other applications. This one, the machine gun. Right, so it's basically projectiles and small explosive devices that you could drop this tool down in your well. It would cause a bunch of explosions, and you would hopefully see increased oil profits. This next one, we actually, this was a small foray into using nuclear weapons as devices for fracking, right? And there was a time in U.S. history where we really didn't realize the dangers of nuclear weapons, and we used them kind of willy-nilly. And so you can see here, so it looks like a missile, right? The gas buggy, drop this nuclear warhead down into the ground, massive wagon wheel as a response, and hopefully increased oil flows from there. So fracking is not something new, right? Fracking's been going on for 200 years. And most of the history of fracking was driven by explosions. Now we actually use really high pressure fluids, so we pop it open in a much different way. We don't send bombs underground to do it, but still, like I said, there's a lot of things to unpack in the modern application of fracking. So as we move forward. In the old days, in the early history of mining, you pretty much had the pressure available in an oil reservoir to draw the oil out. Meaning, because it's underground, there is some pressure, and you could recover, 5 to 10% of the oil from that reservoir before it would quit flowing on its own. And again, early history, we weren't that efficient. So now we actually we increase that recovery rate a couple of different ways. So first of all, we have pumps, right? You see these big pumps. You've got a second video you'll watch that will show us how these massive kind of oil pumps that you always see like out in the oil fields in Texas or the Middle East, kind of always pumping up and down. You can see how that will recover oil. Another thing we can do is actually to drill a second hole. We could put in a second well and actually push water or other fluids or other dense fluids into here and actually increase the pressure by jamming some material that's fairly inexpensive, like water or some other fluid, to drive up crude oil, which is worth far more. The problem obviously being then you have all this kind of foreign fluid down here. So we can get to, in the modern world, we can get to about 50% of the oil from a particular oil play or oil reservoir. And after that, it's generally abandoned, and that oil field or oil patch, as we like to call them, that oil patch is done at that point. But that's not to say that technological advances in the future might not allow us to recover more, but it's hard to say exactly what that looks like. Okay, so that's going to do it for the new content this week. Next week, we're going to start to talk about kind of other forms of oil, right? Unconventional oil. And also, we'll start to get into the politics a little bit. So I figured oil would be worth 2 weeks of class. All right, well, I'll see you next week. Bye.